Greetings. This is a test run, like a rehearsal of a live talk I hope to present to my local community in the next few weeks. So, I wish to present an approach to life and living based on the Torah, the divine instructions of God, a way of living a Torah centric life, even in this high tech world, a life of living in harmony and community and communion with God, just as Yeshua did 2,000 years ago. You might ask, what are my credentials for doing something like this? Well, I've spent the last 40 years in a serious and dedicated search for truth. During this time, I've had to learn a fair bit of what was presented to me as the consensus and correct perspective on many topics. I've often found myself on the wrong side, as it were, the side often of the ridiculed minority. In some cases, on a number of issues, I'd say there's at least half a dozen significant issues that I've been involved with through these last 40 odd years, and certainly have been involved in a fair bit of activism of various sorts, from presenting one of the major submissions to an Australian Federal Senate Select Inquiry some years ago now. That submission is still in the Federal Library in Canberra, to being president of a national not-for-profit pro-life organisation involved in some pretty challenging activism. I've spent time in Canberra meeting with many politicians. I've been on a number of state-level committees. I've presented nationally through various media methods. I've authored quite a number of books, and I'm working on more. So these challenges in my search for truth have led me to write a great many articles and blog posts, as well as some best-selling books, such as the ones I've got in the picture here. More on that later. So I'd like to think I've got some background, some credentials. I'd also might briefly explain my reasons for doing this. Is essentially the Almighty has amazingly blessed me in recent times in the most miraculous ways, and I really feel a need and desire to give back some of what I've learned from him, through him, and try to give to the community. So that's what I'm hoping to do, and I'm hoping this has some merit. So here I'm just doing a short podcast as like a rehearsal for this, as I really believe I can help people find truth, although the world is full of such diverse and extreme views on many topics and issues, and I don't think anyone has all the answers to it, obviously. But very recently, I listened to a brilliant presentation by Dr. Timothy Jennings from the USA, in which he asked and answered this question about finding truth, and what was a most convincing method and approach. He argued that to determine who and what is truth, we need to evaluate the methods that people use to promote what it is that they're trying to promote and share as supposedly representing the truth. So I want to sort of just summarize the methods he used, and with this and all the other stuff I'm going to share, I can provide the links to this talk. You can listen in depth. It's really a must watch, I think, his presentation. And all the other stuff, I've got articles on all of the things that I'm going to briefly touch on here, and obviously the books as well, and so on. But he looks at this critical approach to evaluate, and he argues that people who are presenting truth do so altruistically, right? For some benefit for others. They're not just out for what they can get out of it themselves. And I'm certainly not looking at gaining any sort of financial or monetary benefit from any of this either. They present with openness. They invite critiques to show us a better way. They leave people free to decide, free to make up their own mind. These are healthy methods, right? It's a healthy approach to the world. Truth loses nothing by investigation and questioning. And in fact, often the beauty of that is there might be some lies mixed in, some untruths mixed in with your truth. And the more you investigate and question, the better you can round out and develop and purify that truth. So get your mind around that. Truth loses nothing if we question it. The more we investigate, the more we question it, the more truth shines clear. However, unhealthy methods, if your position is based on misinformation and falsehood, you cannot tolerate questioning and investigation because it'll be too easily shown up. Truth will expose the lies, and therefore people who are advancing a position that's not actually based on evidence truth will use methods not just of falsehood, but of lies, coercion, control, such as vaccine mandates, secrecy, and censoring. These are the unhealthy methods that the purveyors of misinformation and truth are going to use. So they will vilify people, they will deplatform people, they'll try to censor people on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, or now known as X. They will not be open to honest and forthright debate, and they'll not let their position be scrutinized by someone who holds the opposite position. And that this is very important to understand. The use of such dishonest and unhealthy methods is so clear from what's happened the last several years with COVID. One side of this equation has consistently used methods of lies, coercion, control, and secrecy, while the other side has consistently used methods of love, truth, freedom, openness. So you can know to a large degree where the truth lies just by looking at the methods being employed, but you still need to be a critical thinker, I think, and accept that the mainstream media today bombards us with a lot of lies, a lot of misinformation that is not the gospel truth. And sadly, to be a critical thinker, you almost need to almost totally ignore the mainstream media. Just as one example that only come across my desk, as it were, my computer this morning, right? There's an organization in America called NPR, National Public Radios, the conglomerate of a lot of radios that give out news and stuff, along with obviously music. And apparently this group is actually even funded by the government over there. So they argue that they are free and independent journalists, right? They've got this network of at least 200 newsrooms across all of America, and they have a global impact as well, apparently. So their new CEO does a TED talk, and she states that seeking truth could impede progress and unity. To quote her, she says, in fact, our reverence for the truth might be a distraction that's getting in the way of finding common ground and getting things done, right? So what does this mean in real terms? It means her organization doesn't share the truth when it doesn't suit them. They share whatever forwards their agenda. So certainly not open to the truth when they're so quick to ridicule and ignore it. So as I said, it takes time to be a critical thinker. There's a lot of techniques to learn. It's really important actually to even understand things like logical fallacies, but logic is not taught in schools today. I actually did a course in logic as part of a philosophy unit I did at uni. It was quite fascinating. I learned a lot from that, and I've made good use of that. The various techniques of science are not, for the most part, taught. Most people don't, for example, do any really in-depth physics beyond maybe touching on it in year 10. And sadly, they're not equipped to deal with a lot of the issues where science comes into play in this whole issue, because people think science is done by consensus, which is, miles away from the truth. So if we want to seek ultimate truth, though, if this is even to a degree possible, not only do we need to be critical thinkers and learn those appropriate skills, but we need to do so with our whole heart and our whole being. And the Almighty stated this through the prophet Jeremiah, and he said, if you seek me with all your heart, you will find me. And I think the biggest problem is we just don't put our whole heart into it. So that's Jeremiah 29:13, if you want to look that up. So let us begin. I want to just touch on a couple of things to try and highlight this issue. But what I'm arguing for is that the satisfying way to live is within the boundary fence that the Torah, and specifically the Ten Commandments, which is the core of the Torah, presents. The Torah's primary meaning, and I'll talk about its other meanings later, is that it's the divine instructions of God. And I think the word instructions is actually important. Now, I'm certainly, in pushing this approach, I'm far from perfect, just ask my wife. But I'd like to think that it's a rare event these days that I find myself acting well outside of the Torah fence of freedom and outside of those 10 10 commandments or 10 words, because they're really in a sense not commandments. We use that term, but I'll get into that later. They're really instructions that are essentially, if you love God, you will do these things. You're not made to do them. You freely choose to follow them, but there are consequences either way. And I think and I don't know where I first saw or heard this analogy, but I really like this analogy, and I've got it in a couple of my articles that I've published on this. Imagine a father who's just bought a new house that fronts onto a very busy road. He has a couple of very young children, wishes to allow them the freedom to play in that front yard. Maybe the backyard is not very big or something, or very good, or he's got a garden out there. So he set up a lot of the playground activities for them, their swing set and sand pit and stuff. But the front yard's not fenced. And being young children, they have very little idea or recognition of the dangers of the busy cars driving past. So he fences the front yard to provide a safe boundary for the playground where the children are free to play without the danger of any serious injury or even losing their lives from the traffic going by. Well, just think about it. Our Father in heaven has done exactly the same thing. He provided the 10 words, the 10 commandments, as the moral code of the universe. And I have a friend, Frank Selch, who wrote a whole book on that. I've even got a copy of that available, on the fact that the 10 commandments are the moral code of the whole universe, not just, even though you might think they were just given to the Jewish people at Mount Sinai, these are the moral code for everybody on this planet. And this moral code, it's not like this rigid laws and legalities we have to follow. It's this boundary fence, like the boundary fence around the playground, that within which we have great freedom to live and to learn without the serious risk of injury or permanent death and annihilation that we can't recover from. And not only that, if we do manage that, we have this offer of eternal life. We can come to that later as well. But we're just talking about how do we live day to day now. So while there may be many ways in which we can come to know our Father and choose to hear and heed Him to gain life and to gain life eternal, we need to remain within His household, within His boundary fence, if we want to exercise and live a life of peace and joy that gives us, that doesn't result in significant harm and damage to ourselves. So this boundary fence, as I said, protects us because we're God's children. So He's given us this boundary fence of the 10 words. And I just mentioned, I keep using the word Torah. It has several meanings. Its core meaning in Hebrew, the word is actually instruction. So think of it like a teaching. It's sometimes the word Torah is used for the 5 books of Moses, also in Greek called the Pentateuch. It's sometimes shorthand for the whole of the Hebrew Bible, or the Tanakh, which is another word many of us use for the Hebrew Bible. It's also erroneously, you might know it as the Old Testament, which is really incorrect. I can go into why sometime that is, but it's not crucial right now. So at the core then of Torah is the divine instructions. Yeshua referred to this in his 2 greatest commandments, and if you want to look, check it out. The Apostle Paul in Galatians 5:14 also talks about it. But people immediately want to jump in and say, oh, it's too hard, you can't live by that. But the Tanakh, within one of the books of Moses, Deuteronomy, is very, very clear. The Almighty says it is not too hard for us. He says it's a very practical thing. He says this is instruction that He gives us that is not beyond us. It's not across the sea. It's not in heaven. It's close. It's in our heart that we may do it. So we need to appreciate that it's not something that we can't do. So there's lots of places where He tells us, we have the choice to choose life and goodness or death and evil, right? And if we choose the wrong thing, we bring upon ourselves the curses because we've chosen not to follow Him, not to keep within His boundary. That there are significant things that don't go our way as a result. So it might not seem too obvious to you, but I want to look at just one example of that actually. So I want to look at just one. I want to start on one of the 10 words. I've written a lot on this. I've got a whole chapter of one of my books on Shabbat, on the Sabbath. But I just want to touch on it. So we're commanded or instructed, as I say is a better word, to take one day a week off, to have this day that's an indicator of freedom. It's certainly important to appreciate that in the past, people didn't have the freedom to take a day off, unless they're the kings and the top hierarchy, the elites, whatever. Then in the ancient world, they didn't get any day off. No nation had that freedom. So the Sabbath, when it was first instituted with the Jewish people, was one of the greatest gifts of God that's ever been given, a day free from labour to honour the King of the universe, our Creator. In their desert wanderings in the exile from Egypt, it's fascinating if you read up on this, that a double portion of the manna was collected on the sixth day to last through the seventh day, the Sabbath. When they tried to collect it on any other day, the extra, it rotted. So God, even this was a daily miracle for 40 years, or most of that 40 years when they were receiving the manna. God was providing this miracle, showing that on Friday, when they collected twice as much, so they'd have enough to get them through Saturday, through the Sabbath, it didn't rot. But when they tried to collect twice as much any other day, it rotted very, very quickly. So he was showing them how important it was to him that they cease from their labour, from their normal labours of providing for themselves and their families. So the Sabbath's a day to quit normal work that earns you an income in any way, and it's instead a day to be spent in community and family and study and prayer, discussion and peace, right? A day to try to get ourselves back in touch with ourselves, with our family, with our world, with the world around us. So a day of spiritual and intellectual growth, really, and a day of hopefully domestic harmony. Observing the Sabbath reminds us to sanctify our lives, to make them special. That's what it means to sanctify, to put it aside, to see the special. It doesn't limit our freedom. In fact, it helps guide us towards holiness and towards more meaningful lives. As the Almighty says, the first days he made good, the seventh day he made holy. He made it a day that's special, holy, suggesting a separation to God, a connection between us and our Creator. So I'd already sort of mentioned that there. So on the Sabbath, we search for the essence of God. We look to see him as we might read the Torah portion, something I can go into that we do. And we learn a lot, and there's lots of commentaries on it we can study as well. But it's an antidote to the tendency towards self-idolatry as well. And I should say Shabbat is the word in Hebrew. In English we say Sabbath, but it means the same thing. So it's a time when we should not have any guilt about having some downtime. It's a time to remind us of our potential for doing good. We're created as a bridge. On the sixth day, we were created as a bridge between the world and the divine, between the rest of creation created in those first 5 days and the Almighty who sanctified the seventh day. So we're that bridge. So an appreciation of a productive day is predicated on a week of labour, because the book of Exodus, one of the 5 books of Moses, says 6 days you shall labour and do all your work. So the understanding you don't do it on the seventh day. And we should emulate the creative side of God. We're made in his image to be creative beings, and he took a rest on that seventh day. The Sabbath then is the culmination of a productive week on which the non-productivity can be appreciated only when preceded by the creativity of the week. So it's actually quite fascinating to be in Israel. I've been to Israel a couple of times, and particularly I think to be in Jerusalem on Friday and see all the shops closing down around 3 in the afternoon, everyone hurrying home, so I'll be home for Shabbat, for sunset, because the day starts at sunset on Friday. And it's also equally amazing to see how quick all those shop fronts go up as soon as the Sabbath is over on Saturday night. So most of the shops will open from sunset, just after sunset on Saturday through to midnight Saturday. And so it is certainly a fascinating lesson to see how much they follow it, and to see all the men walking home on Friday afternoons carrying flowers. A common practice is to bring flowers home on Shabbat. Eve. So the Sabbath was given to the Israelites as a reminder of God freeing them from slavery. So this day off is a day to remember that we're not slaves and that we have freedom. So it should serve as the same for all of us, for all people who particularly follow Yeshua and his disciples and the Apostle Paul, who all clearly observe Shabbat every week. And we can see that in the writings of the Apostle Paul. So as I said, every day that we observe Sabbath, every week we observe Sabbath, we get closer, I think, to understanding God, and to appreciating it's real. It's not some esoterical, theoretical, peace in your head, spiritual day. It's a real day where you take time out from the pressures of life and the pressures of work. And obviously it can be very difficult if people are doctors or emergencies. You can't necessarily take Saturday off. You might have to make it some other day of the week. And certainly, saving life should always take precedence over these things. But I loved it. There's a famous Jewish scholar, Abraham Joshua Heskel, back in 51, wrote a great book on the Sabbath, and he said the Sabbath is spirit in the form of time, which once you understand it, I think it's a very cool approach. So the other thing I want to look at as part of it is that the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, and the New Testament, but particularly in the Tanakh, we see a lot of subtle narratives. I say subtle because if we really dig into them and spend the time studying them, we find there's lots of subtle lessons in life within the Tanakh. And I want to just touch on one of those as an example, and that's one that fascinated me for some time, and that's the story of Rebecca that's in the first book of the Bible, Genesis, which is a pretty long book. I've read many books commentating on Genesis, and a Professor Gary Rensburg, to me, has got a different approach to a lot. Amazing Hebrew scholar, and he brings out this story. He's the one that put me onto this idea of looking at the life of Rebecca, the wife of Isaac. And as you might know, that the Jewish people were founded under Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or Yaakov. So we'll come back to that. But it's interesting that the story of Rebecca really shows a principle of life of measure for measure, that things are given back to you. So when you bless someone, you get blessed in return. When you curse someone, you quite possibly get cursed in return. When you do something that is wrong, that is in some way wrong and evil, you will get something back. And Matthew says this is Luke 6:38. This is even more so in the Tanakh, but you can see it's in the New Testament as well. For with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. So I want to look at an example of that, the extremely painful consequences that most people have never thought about this, that Rebecca suffers in her role in deceiving her husband. And you may not even thought about the fact that that's exactly what she did. So this is, as I said, in Professor Gary Rensburg's brilliant book on Genesis. He offers a great number of insights like this. He's currently the chair of the Department of Jewish Studies at Rutgers University in America. His level of academic scholarship is outstanding. He's considered one of the world's leading authority on the study of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is fascinating, and other ancient Jewish texts. But I like his ability to analyze literature. So he concedes that, and I think I've got this on the next slide, a quote from him. He concedes that Genesis is an amazing piece of literature, that on the surface it might look very, very simple, but he says there's a lot of very great and deep literary sophistication in there. And that he concludes that that the literature the Jewish people used played a very important role in their lives, and so they really were the people of the book. Another fascinating book that really explains this and looks at the historical development of literature within the Israeli people, within the Jews, is a book by Professor Paul Johnson. It's probably the seminal work, very thick, comprehensive book called A History of the Jews. And he points out they were possibly the very first ethnic group that were predominantly literate. That most of them, back if you go many thousands of years, were literate. So we're talking, 3,000, 3,500 years ago, and was very common for them to not only read but write. And within families, a lot of writing was done, and a lot of that writing has survived in various ways, such as we see in the Dead Sea Scrolls and so on. So when therefore, what Rensburg is highlighting that there's some subtleties um, in the text that you don't necessarily see on the surface. And I think most of us, when we read this, we might never have questioned, wasn't Rebecca doing the wrong thing? Because she lied to her husband, she deceived her husband, and in fact, Genesis 27 makes that clear that she did deceive her husband. We can't really be sure if he was totally deceived or not. It just went along with it. But certainly it was an ungodly act that she engaged in. And it resulted in Yaakov being given a blessing that was meant for his older brother Esau, as far as we understand it. But the significant thing is the result of all of this deception meant that Yaakov, and you might know him as Jacob, but his Hebrew name was Yaakov, he left the family home and traveled far away, and he didn't return for 20 years. And it appears from what we know, because we don't read exactly when Rebekah died, although most of the patriarchs and matriarchs, the husbands and wives of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, we know about, but we don't know when she died. The Bible doesn't actually tell us when she died, but it appears she was dead sometime within that 20 years. She never gets to see her son again. So she's been involved in this deception, and she pays a very heavy price, because it appears that he was her favoured son of her sons. So we have to feel for the price she paid was absolutely huge. What she did was clearly wrong and displayed a lack of trust, I think, in God, that he would have somehow made it all work out. She wanted it to work out through her youngest son. She knew that was what had been prophesied, but she took it into her own hands to do something which was wrong. So even though Yaakov was a young adult when he left his side, that enforced separation would have seriously diminished both their lives. And you can consider that Yaakov perhaps could move on to a large degree and find comfort in his wives, because he had a couple, Rachel and Leah and Rachel, and so on. But his loss of his relationship with his mother, even though he's a young adult, I think would still have resulted in some unseen costs to his emotional and spiritual growth as well. So it's hard to know what the impact is on Yaakov, but certainly there was impact on him. So he was paid and judged in some way. In fact, it's interesting when we look at the ways, if you study at his relationships with his brother and so on, he certainly paid a heavy price. But in some ways, I think Rachel paid a much heavier price. And so looking at some of the other impacts here, once Isaac gives his blessing to Yaakov, he can't reverse it, because, a man was a man of his word and his oath. And even though Esau pleads for a blessing as well, it can't be the same or as good. And Rensburg quotes on this. He said, "Words spoken have a power unto their own, according to the biblical mode of thinking." I've written quite a bit on this, the power of God. Just when God speaks, it happens. So his word is all powerful. And in a way, because we're made in his image, there's a sense in which when we speak something into the world, it has immense power. So we do have to be so careful with our tongue. And I think we all fail at times in that regard. I certainly know I do. In many places, though, when we look, we see that concept of measure for measure being reinforced. And Yeshua certainly reiterated it. And I've written a couple of articles on it. We see so many examples throughout both the Tanakh and in the New Testament on how that measure for measure, how things get paid back. And so in this case of Rebecca, again, to repeat, she never gets to see Yaakov again. When he returns to the land of Canaan, he's reunited with Esau and his father, but there's no mention of Rebecca or her death, despite the events she orchestrated being so central to the events that led to his leaving for fear of his life. We don't hear about her. And yet, when we look closely, she perhaps brought us on herself when she said, and when she encouraged him to be involved in impersonating his brother, she says, may your curse be upon me, my son. So I think she knew what she was getting into, but perhaps she never fully appreciated the pain of the separation she'd suffer as a result of it. And Rensburg says about all of this, he said, it's very subtle in the narrative. You know, there's no statement saying the moral of the story is don't deceive your blind father husband. You have to figure these things out without any guidance from the author, and yet you're I think also invited to participate in the act of storytelling by being an attentive listener. And our appreciation that this was part of the culture of the time. They were very, very attentive, and I think we tend to gloss over all of these things in our lives, and we don't appreciate the depth that's contained here within the Bible. And when I've taught students, and particularly as a physicist and mathematician, um, and I've said to the really bright kids who are keen to go on and pursue intellectual debate challenges, to me, that when you look at what are the things that you might want to pursue that are really intellectually demanding, I can think genetics is an incredible area of study, because it appears that when you make a car, you put a user manual for the car in the car. So you've got some idea of how to use it and manage it and keep it running and so on. And it appears that within the DNA in our bodies, there's a user manual there. We're only just starting to discover it, which is really quite incredible that the Almighty has even put a user manual in, which we're only starting to uncover what it is and what it says. Quite incredible. So genetics is one area. Obviously, as a physicist, I find cosmology and astronomy fascinating. But even more so than that, I say, well, do cognitive science, the study of the brain. The brain's the most complex thing in the entire universe, as far as we know, the human brain. So being a cognitive scientist, studying the workings of the brain, I've read a lot of great books by people on studying all sorts of areas of that, such as Dr. Jeffrey Schwartz, who is an expert on OCD, on obsessive compulsive disorder. His work is quite incredible. What he's learned about the brain using PET scans, and that's positron emission tomography scans and so on. So that is that's three fascinating areas. But I say them ultimately, what can be more fascinating, more intellectually challenging than studying the creator of the whole universe? You can't get more challenging than that. And so that's where we come to the Bible. And so this is just one example of the depth is quite incredible. If you really want to put the time and effort into it, I think a lifetime is just not enough. But so coming back to Yaakov, he receives his punishment. Like, he thinks he's going to marry Rachel after working for her father for 7 years. He wakes up to find, I don't know how that happened, but they obviously hooded her or something. He wakes up to find he's married her older sister Leah. And you think about the irony when he complains to Laban, his father-in-law, "What is this that you've done to me? Why did you deceive me?" And Laban replies, it is not so done in our place to give the younger before the firstborn. And that seems like a direct, relation. Remember, Esau came out before they were twins, but before Yaakov. So it's almost like he's referring back to, like, he knew the deception that had taken place. So here we see Yaakov being punished for, in a sense, doing the same thing and having placed himself, the younger brother, before his older brother, Esau, the firstborn. So it's like a quid pro quo, or a measure for measure punishment dealt by the hand of an agent of God, Laban in this case, rather than the Almighty himself. An even more appropriate punishment was to come from when we read of his story of his being tricked, another quid pro quo, into believing his favored son Joseph is dead, when Joseph gets sent off to Egypt, which turned out really good for Israel and the people of Israel. But again, his father, Yaakov, was tricked. So he certainly, there are ways in which it seems he certainly got paid back. So to repeat, they both suffer from the deception. I feel that Rebecca paid the greater price here, because she lost that relationship. I think that was a pretty heavy price. And we don't know how God would have still provided and brought into existence the 12 sons if it hadn't happened this way. But I personally am sure that his will would still have been done in some way or other. So I think part of what living within the boundary fence of Torah is and as we learn this stuff, it's learning about what grace and justice and faithfulness are, and that we are to exercise those things as Yeshua did and as Jehovah God, the Almighty. You'll notice I use the term Hashem, which is Hebrew for the name, because the Tetragrammaton, the Yud Hey Vav Hey, is the actual. He declares that's his name, Yud Hey Vav Hey, and we're not certain of how it's pronounced. There's a lot of debate over that for all sorts of reasons I won't get into right now, but I do feel that Jehovah at least is a good. You'll hear some people say Yahweh or Yahweh, but I think Jehovah is better. But also for me and my family and my wife, we found that Hashem is actually weirdly but more personable when we use that name. It for us gives us a better connection to him. It's like a personal name, like a pet name, if you like. But part of grace, justice, and faithfulness is in exercising judgment and discernment in all things, to exhibit fairness in all our actions, right? So to trust God, and that's not easy, to trust Him when you're facing losing your job and losing your home because you won't be able to pay the mortgage and so on. To trust Him through all of those things, to be obedient to Him, and to continue to act righteously. But I've certainly found in my life that when you trust Him, He provides in an amazing miracles. And weirdly, at the 11th hour, we almost were living in a caravan, but He blessed us so abundantly. It's just incredible. So to me, if we learn to show kindness, to love kindness, and to do so with overflowing love, that's part of what this whole mean life living within Torah means. But everything is built on Torah. It's built on this boundary fence of the 10 words. And by exercising these foundational truths, I think we can help repair a broken world and raise up other truth seekers, which is part of what I hope that we will do. So in following on with these sessions, there's so much to share what's wrong with Hellenistic Christianity today. There's so many doctrines that have been brought in that are really, really unhelpful, and I've written books on this as well. I've got many blog posts and articles on my websites about how we live this faith that Yeshua lived and follow the way he followed. And so that's what I would like to consider people might want to join me to do, both locally and perhaps online. And I have to say, I think people then want to put a title on it, which is very, very difficult. But a more accurate description, I think, of this way of living might be described. A friend of mine in America who's a great scholar called it Yeshua Judaism. I'm not sure it might put people off, but as you get into it, it certainly makes sense that he was promoting the true Judaism of the faith of Israel against a lot of, and even in his day, people that were getting it wrong and have got a lot worse wrong since then, perhaps. But to me, that's a better title for the faith of Yeshua and his followers. One of the other ways I like to present it as a theme is we believe in one God. Jehovah is the only one man. Yeshua is the end times Messiah, and that needs a lot of fleshing out as well. What does that all mean? A Messiah means anointed one. So what was he anointed to do? But he certainly came to preach 2,000 years ago one mission, and that was the kingdom of God. And so that's another massive area I've written a lot on that I can share in the future if people are interested. So, as I said, I'm happy to share all the links to all this material, and I've just put up here some of those links. Happy to share this to my books and to my websites, or just to some of them. So that's just my introduction. This is just a trial run that I'm going to post online, and hope to get some feedback to see whether or not I should consider doing this live and see if I encourage people who might be seeking truth within the local community here. So thank you for your time listening, and I hope there's been something that's enlightened and helped you, and I really love to hear back from you. So take care. Shalom.